In theory, there was no treaty prohibition against licking the ambassador. As the Galactic Council Tribunal convened to deliberate on the most recent human occurrence, Captain Raw made that his opening statement in defense. Even though the envoy, a five-eyed, gelatinous Borthol from Sector Luma 9, had at least physically recovered by now, the incident was nevertheless classified as a Category 7 serious interspecies diplomatic infraction. In actuality, though the licking was only a diversion, the true purpose was accomplished by Specialist Dinar, who had left the facility during the event carrying a memory core that had 3 months' worth of combat plans from the Cathari Dominion, while the Borthol thrashed and gave forth undulating shrieks. As it happened, licking was a great cover. For cycles, the galaxy would discuss how a species that was written off as merely tier to sentient had transformed a whole political summit into a farce and taken confidential information with them. For the Terran delegation, however, it was only a Tuesday, and for the majority of the Galactic Council, it was their first genuine taste of what humans could bring to a battlefield even if it was a diplomatic chamber. The Cathari Dominion's incursion into disputed areas near the periphery of the Velian Accord months prior marked the beginning of the actual conflict. Just pressure-forward bases, mining stations being silently taken, silent creeping expansionism, announcements, no discussions. Such quiet incursions were not well received by humanity, which was hardly let into the Accord. However, the humans only had one inquiry in place of military escalation or frontline deployments. Where is the rule book? That was not humanity's first error, but everyone else's. Engagement distances, permissible collateral, and restrictions on strategic interference, many centuries of carefully crafted clean combat, aimed at preserving power balances and minimizing civilian casualties were the normal procedures that the Velians provided them. Though more vicious, the Cathary's understanding was nonetheless strictly within galactic bounds. After nodding, the humans immediately turned their backs on everything. The first occurrence occurred on Soltran's Hold, a mining outpost believed to be lightly protected that was floating on asteroid debris. After cutting off communications and deploying shock soldiers, the Cathari, in keeping with their tradition, took control of it. Soltran resumed all communications 4 hours later. By the time Council investigators arrived, Cathari forces had disappeared. The base was undamaged and the systems were operational, but the Cathari had vanished. Some claimed they had been vaporized. Others discussed silent room-by-room purges and Hoover ventings. However, that wasn't the startling aspect. Next time, bring a toothbrush. You're going to need it. That was the startling portion that was left on the command panel. There was no formal claim of authorship or signature, just that mysterious message and the immediate realization that the way this battle would be conducted had altered. The top command of Cathari started to deploy. They dispatched assassins into areas under Terran control and reinforced important outposts. Every move, however, was met with something entirely unexpected rather than with equal force. Encoded troop placements, pirate radio broadcasts that took over Cathari channels, with human opera and phony surrender beacons that guided destroyers into minefields. When sprayed into air vents, a bioengineered fungus caused Cathari warriors to experience the delusions of melting weaponry. Technically, it was all legal. As long as no fictitious surrenders were made, there were no laws specifically prohibiting the use of naturally occurring microbiological agents in psychological warfare or the disguise of oneself as an adversary during infiltration. It came out that humans had brought rubber bands, and the rules were designed to be stretched. It was at this period that Lieutenant Griggs became something of a legend, though their real weaponry consisted of a startling amount of drones shaped like wounded wildlife and very few lances. He commanded a squadron known as the 17th Lancers. Griggs gained notoriety for luring Cathari troops in with what appeared to be injured Terran soldiers pleading for help, only to have the soldiers burst into smoke screens and flashbangs as they got close, confusing adversaries as actual commandos struck from overhead. There was no one else who thought or fought like that. Battle and honor were holy to the Cathari. They even had a sort of martial code for their vicious raids. However, they grinned excessively when they explained that, in theory, there is nothing that prevents a shuttle from being packed with bees, or that placing explosive charges inside food supplies is a valid defense against enemy plundering. The pivotal moment occurred during the important Battle of Kelroth Basin. There were thousands of ships. The human fleet was almost a third smaller. According to every conventional paradigm of galactic warfare, they ought to have retreated or adopted a defensive posture. Rather, the Terran admiral issued a single directive: make them believe we fled. The Terran ships made a dramatic departure, dropping debris, dumping drones, and venting fuel. It appeared to be a rout. They were pursued by the Cathari through an asteroid cemetery, past the nebula rim, and across the stars. They were unaware that the retreat route had been meticulously planned, mapped weeks beforehand, and booby-trapped with the eye-controlled artillery stations concealed inside hollowed-out asteroids, as well as kinetic mines. It was a performance rather than a war, a trap so complex that half of the Cathari fleet destroyed itself before they even realized the humans had halted their flight. A delayed virus uploaded during a previous distress beacon exchange caused the first Cathari commander's engines to explode by the time he signaled withdrawal. They lost the instant they appeared, in human terms. The galaxy began to pay attention to the mindset and language humans used in strategy briefings, including chess metaphors, poker references, and game-related anecdotes, in addition to the techniques. Half the objective of a game called rugby was to fool the opposition by feigning an injury. As the Council studied Terran military history, it discovered that troops had used cardboard to simulate entire battalions, generals had staged their own deaths, and children's games had been transformed into martial arts exercises. What's the worst? The humans were enjoying themselves. In the past, the Arcani Collective had taken great satisfaction in having created the mechanisms for resolving galactic disputes. Every pact had their linguistic imprint, and every war scenario they created became standard procedure. They thought they had measured aggression and transformed war into a formula with quantifiable risks and predictable results, in order to observe Terran behavior in accordance with Council standards. The Arcani demanded a monitored skirmish, test a minor authorized military exercise when humanity was officially awarded Tier 2 designation. The humans agreed. The Arcani anticipated a quick encounter with overt strategies and courteous retreats. They were given a whole training facility that had been transformed into a maze with mirrored walls, low-frequency sound blasts, and a contrived weather system that showered a strong liquid that was intended to damage the Arcani's nerves. Before the first shot was fired, the Arcanid teams were confused. Communications were jumbled. SQUAD leaders reported hallucinations caused only by a mixture of pheromone interference and strobe lights, but not by any deadly weapon. The Arcani eventually gave up, not because they had suffered any losses, but rather because they were unable to determine the precise number of humans they were up against. The number varied according on the corridor. An official objection was made by the chief Arcani strategist. He characterized the encounter as an entirely intolerable fusion of uncontrolled improvisation and psychological anarchy. He received a fruit basket from the people in return. A map of the facility, totally composed of licorice, was included. It became evident that precedent did not apply to Terran conflict. Confound, destabilize, disrupt, and survive seemed to be their entire military philosophy. They converted agricultural drones into instruments for reconnaissance. They taught their men to lie, gamble, and tell stories in addition to discipline and weaponry. Deception was fundamental, not merely a strategy. Boredom itself was turned into a weapon. To attract heat-seeking AI drones, entire regiments were trained to remain still for 20 hours. For humans, the adversary only needed to be caught off guard, long enough for the weather, the terrain, or the rules of engagement to change, not destroyed. Disruption was the aim, not victory. The aftertaste was victory. 3 Terran officers were called in to be questioned by the Dravathi War Tribunal when they met to discuss the pattern of behavior. Although there were already chairs available, one person brought a deck of playing cards, another brought nothing, and a third brought a chair. "Why the chair?" asked the head of the tribunal. The cop gave a shrug. "Didn't say I couldn't." This little statement started to circulate through the council archives, reverberating like a negative echo. It perfectly encapsulated the Terran approach without saying I couldn't. It was fair game as long as it wasn't specifically prohibited by the regulations. Even so, it was still regarded as negotiable if the repercussions were not urgent. Terran surrender procedures were strange. 2. During one campaign, a human forward base used the appropriate code to send a surrender signal on a regular frequency. With caution, the Cathari advanced, only to find the entire base deserted save for a recurrent broadcast of human warriors singing off-key sea shanties. 5 minutes later, the base exploded, releasing a fine metallic powder that blocked Cathari. Optics for the following 6 hours, but not killing the invaders. The cosmos started to understand that humans didn't only disregard the same playing field, they didn't even transgress the laws. Every battleground was also a theater, every encounter a bluff, and every quiet moment a loaded pause for a Terran unit. It was made worse by the fact that they were somewhat inexperienced in galactic combat. They took advantage of the lack of expectations placed on them. The Yashari, a council member race renowned for their cultural veneration of battle as a sacred rite, were the species most frightened. Formal announcements, reciprocal honors, and even poetry preceded every conflict. Terran methods were considered a sacrilege by them. A Yasharai fleet rehearsed their ceremonial opening, a 20-minute chant that was aired on all networks during one now famous battle. At minute 3, the humans, of course, fired their first missile. When questioned later, the Terran commander claimed to think the chant was a diversion. Additionally, he said, they didn't specify when we had to begin. Shortly after, the Yasharai halted diplomatic ties. However, not everyone was against Terran techniques. Terran philosophies were adopted by the Hudik Mercenary Guild, a gang notorious for acting outside council laws. Huge amounts of minerals and new flavors of soda were paid to human mercenary advisors. The council found it scary that a whole underground market of Terran military advisors had developed, some of whom were experts at teaching other species to think like humans. The Accord's leaked internal memos revealed contentious debates. While some council members viewed the humans as an essential check on Dominion aggression, others wished to penalize them. Some were subtly frightened but refused to talk publicly. In official documents, the term unconventional combat assets started to appear, which is code for let the humans handle it. We don't want to know how. The Battle of Relic Prime marked a shift in public sentiment. The Cathari had dug deep here, establishing air denial platforms, orbital defense systems, and surface bunkers. Every analysis projected that any attacking force would suffer enormous losses. The Indari Navy declined to commit, and the Velians demanded a postponement. Humans, however, offered their services. The UNV Dogcatcher was the only ship they sent in. The Dogcatcher, a renovated Terran destroyer modified for atmospheric entry, was old by today's standards. Leaking coolant and blaring jazz across every available channel, it slouched into Relic's orbit. Nothing occurred for an hour. Then Relic's surface started to flash with lights. It was software meltdown, not bombardment, that brought down the Cathari defenses. Turrets started attacking their own supply depots. Power systems were overburdened, and climatic controls were inverted, transforming hardened bunkers into wind tunnels. During its orbital pass, the Dogcatcher had broadcast an intrusive algorithm created by Spatula, a Terran hobbyist. The galaxy discovered something new that day. The humans never stopped fighting. Relic Prime fell within a day, and not a single Terran boot touched the ground. They were constantly working on something, even when they were laughing, smiling, or appeared to be receding, giving up, or disintegrating. There were no battle anthems or ceremonial drums, only the hiss of filtered air and the faint hum of encrypted projectors as the Cathari High Conclave convened in quiet. 20-7 warlords gazed at the replay of Relic Prime's collapse, their crests tense. It showed neither bombardments nor infantry, nor did it show explosions. It displayed flashing screens and blinking lights, a war lost in real time due to environmental sabotage and software malfunctions without a single direct attack. The Cathari had no idea what had transpired. The humans had caused the defenses to twist inward, like a muscle fighting its own bone, rather than breaking through them. A spacecraft, named for an animal control profession, has taken down the Quadrant's best stronghold. It was an hour before the Conclave spoke. Nearly a full cycle into his employment, one of the junior tacticians finally voiced the question that they were all afraid to ask. What if they aren't attempting to win the war? The room shifted. The tactician went on, what if they're attempting to alter it? He was not mistaken. In other parts of the world, human units were changing the battlefield itself, while council diplomats discussed penalties. On Drenthus 4, entire ecosystems were recruited. During planetary nightfall, Terran engineers redirected the migration patterns of local wildlife to camps for feeding Cathari. Industrial-grade adhesives were poured into air vents on Crave Station. By a human spacecraft, sealing control panels shut until the internal temperatures compelled evacuation. None of these actions were forbidden. In fact, none of them were even contemplated by earlier rules. That was the issue. It wasn't that humanity had been late to the galaxy stage. They had read the script, burned it, and then written their own council. Enforcement agents demanded a formal explanation after Captain Thorne of the 8th Orbital Irregulars captured a Cathari listening post by posing as a traveling circus troupe. The response, which included costumes and illustrations, was 12 pages long. Me schematics and a flowchart called Dancing Clowns and You, Disarmament Through Distraction. The footnotes alone were 4 pages long. But despite the ridiculous appearance, the post had fallen with no losses, and the Cathari commander signed his own surrender while cheering and juggling. But beneath the humor was something more sinister. The humans treat warfare not as a tragedy but as a puzzle, and worse, they enjoy solving it, a Cathari historian once wrote. 2 weeks later, the historian vanished, supposedly due to natural causes. They sealed his files. The council, which was becoming more and more divided, started an independent investigation into Terran military conduct. Teams were sent to command centers for humans. More than anything, they were troubled by what they discovered. On the battlefield, the Terrans lacked a unified philosophy of combat and a coherent doctrine. Every cop received training in dozens of strategies that contradicted one another. Not only was improvisation valued, it was ranked. Units were commended for their unconventional goal-solving and surprising shift in the enemy's emphasis, for using only mirrors, a fog machine, and 3 pre-recorded disagreements between chefs to overcome a sniper nest. 1 squad received an award. One inspector observed, "The way actors practice for stage plays is like they trained for war." A week later, that inspector quit in silence, saying, "Nothing is real until they make it so." The last straw occurred during the Battle of Terrans. The mall was a treacherous area. There was a tight passageway between 2 gravity wells. The Cathari challenged any ship to attempt passage and placed heavy artillery in the center. The council suggested retreat, but the Velians refused. Decommissioned modules, broken escape pods, and thousands of abandoned satellites were all shot into the tunnel simultaneously by the humans. It was ridiculed by the Cathari as desperate. The capsules then opened, releasing speaker drones broadcasting human radio ads from millennia ago, signal bouncers, reflective flares, and fake ID tags. Targeting systems looped. Cathari sensors overloaded until they overheated. The cannon fired at rubbish and echoes. Disguised as part of the debris cloud, the actual Terran fleet arrived silently and in low. The Cathari had blinded their weapons and surrounded their ships with their own wreckage by the time they realized the attack. In 37 minutes, it was over. Admiral Raw was then asked by a council delegate what they should title this strategy. Raw only said, "Taking out the trash." They chuckled, but uncomfortably, as the humans seemed to be indifferent to the name given to their triumphs. They were there to survive and, if at all possible, to trick their adversaries into submitting. They were not there for honor, status, or ceremony, at least through farce, if not fire. Even worse, human conduct has started to spread. Other animals were adjusting. Creative adversity scenarios, a training program created with Terran consultants, was offered by the Broxy Consortium. Their old tactical codes were being reinterpreted by the Grell Council. Even the conservative Andari, who advocated for more flexible approaches, commissioned a research on nonlinear engagement tactics. Although they would not identify the author, everyone was observing the humans, and nobody, not even the humans themselves, could guess what they would do next. One human term started to show up in intercepted conversations during the last weeks of the Cathari offensive, when supply lines broke out and morale started to deteriorate. Shenanigans. Nobody understood its meaning. The Qataris thought it was a code, possibly a psychological weapon or a new class of ship. Every intercepted use was decoded. The context varied greatly and was employed to covert operations, diversionary tactics, and what one officer called as a coordinated confusion cascade involving goats and bagpipes. Shenanigans was even thought to be the name of a Terran war deity in some high command circles. It wasn't. It was only the flavor of the struggle that humans contributed. There was no great fight, no declaration, and no fleet confrontation when the last assault arrived. Rather, the humans implemented what they called a reverse siege. Instead, they dug into deserted habitats, destroyed relay systems, fell behind enemy lines, and imprisoned themselves within Cathari territory. They publicly declared their positions and then remained there. Generals in Qatar argued about whether this was a trap or surrender. It was both. Despite the brutality of the Terran defense, every Cathari onslaught against these cells was unsuccessful due to tactics so peculiar that the assailants started to hesitate before striking. There have been stories of enemy bunkers discovered to be empty of anything except mannequins, mines designed like toys, even capitulation signals that turned out to be holograms concealing weaponry. In their official logs, Terran warriors started calling themselves poltergeists. One lieutenant wrote, "I don't need to win," in a journal. That was taken. "I just need them confused enough not to notice we already won." Humanity corrupted everyone else's standards of combat, which the galaxy had expected them to follow. A whole bunch of Cathari cruisers deserted in the last days. They pointed to exhaustion and tactical folly. According to a communication recorded by one commander, "We were trained to fight armies, not improv theater with orbital artillery." Neither Earth nor any Valian world hosted the Council's post-conflict settlement meeting. The UNV Reasonable Request, a diplomatic ship from Terra, served as its host. Naturally, the name was a joke. There were no anthems or banners flying within the main hall. The Fourth Psychological Irregulars, who were well known at the time for taking down a garrison with just whiteboards and phony news reports, were the only ceremonial guards the Terrans brought. Most delegations approached cautiously as negotiations got underway because many thought there would be another ruse. Irony, poisoning, was the reason given by one Yasharai delegation for refusing to drink the water. But more than any weapon could have scared everyone, there were no last-minute interruptions or pranks. Just a composed, professional group of people who listened intently, asked insightful questions, and negotiated politely. After all, what did it say about how purposeful their mayhem had been if the humans could act in such a manner when peace was on the table? 17 agenda items that were directly influenced by Terran battlefield behavior were included in the final accord, which was eventually formalized as the principles of adaptive engagement. For example, the intentional use of humorous misdirection to manipulate emotions was prohibited under Clause 6b. The deployment of animals for psychological disturbance was prohibited by Clause 9 unless the proper warning was given. When Admiral Raw signed the treaty, he leaned back and remarked, "We'll behave unless someone doesn't." The galaxy knew he meant it when he said, "Under no circumstances may them be utilized within diplomatic stations." In the years that followed, there were no more incursions, conflicts, or explorations of the Terran frontiers, and the Cathari went silent. By eschewing some of their most stringent norms in favor of what they dubbed contingent operational paradigms, their military initiated a significant cultural reorganization. The rest of the galaxy grudgingly and eventually followed. The training regiments of the Archini were reorganized. To provide pauses for countermeasures, the Ashari altered a number of their sacred songs. Despite its extensive bureaucracy, the Council also established a new standing committee called the Office of Nonlinear Conflict Anticipation, whose only goal is to question what would a human do. However, despite the galaxy's adaptation, no one was able to perfectly duplicate the original, because no program could teach the fundamentals of Terran fighting. Because survival had never been assured for the majority of their existence, They battled as though they had never trusted the laws in the first place, not because they were careless. Disease, climate change, conflict, and turmoil have all made Earth a testing ground. Their tales were about cunning survival, cunning tricksters, and making it up as they went along, not about honorable loss. Their battles were judged by how long they could endure while bleeding, starving, and laughing, instead of by how much land they captured. The human weapon was not numbers or technology, but the fight itself, not the battle. The fight, the thing behind the eyes when the ammunition runs out, the half smile when surrounded, the shrug that says, well, might as well try something. Stupid. It wasn't exactly bravery or insanity, but a peculiar combination of the two, tinged with the profound knowledge that sometimes the only sensible course of action was to be ridiculous. As a result, the galaxy started to change, not because it wished to emulate humans, but rather because it could not afford to misunderstand them in the future. 7 council languages would translate a Terran field manual years later. The instant you set the rules, we'll figure out how to break them, but how to break them not out of disrespect, but because that's how we survive was the quote that started it, not tactics or formations.